didn't know I got a graphic. This is very exciting. It's great to meet everyone. I'm Divya, and I will be talking about ownership and technology. I think it's really crucial, as in the talk we just heard, to think about the materiality of what ownership looks like. And even on the technology side, I think a lot of the ways that ownership and technology play together do speak to that materiality, and I think it's really important when we think about who owns and who gets to control these technologies, that we also think about all of the ways that they are grounded in the real world, they're grounded in labor, they're grounded in supply chains, all of these kinds of things. So with that, I am here because I co-run an organization called the Collective Intelligence Project with the fantastic Saffron Huang, who's in the audience. And what we care about is collective ownership over the future. And to us, that means that we need to have ways for people to both own and input into the direction of transformative technologies. We do that in different ways. Currently, we've been focusing a lot on democratic input and ownership into artificial intelligence. And the reason for that is we see this as a technology that is going to underpin transformative change in the world. Transformations can really be good or bad. And so I think it's really our hope that we can take this transition that we think will happen and move it in the direction of collective ownership and collective good. A bunch of our work in this space has looked like running large-scale democratic input processes into major AI models, including with labs like OpenAI and Anthropic in the UK government, working with policymakers in Taiwan, doing a bunch of very specific democratic input processes, as well as thinking a lot about the enclosure of the digital commons that AI basically relies on. And I think that brings me to this core reason why we care about AI, which is that it does break a lot of existing notions of property. And so Matt mentioned this at the beginning, right? AI kind of disrupts this idea of data or any digital assets as private property. It disrupts the way we think about copyright and what it means to create original content. It can extrapolate all sorts of private data from non-private data, which means there is something inherently surveillance-oriented in some ways about the technology. It can learn more about you than you have given it access to. It disrupts intellectual property. And a lot of it is built on things that are commonly owned, whether that is all of the data on the internet or much of the open source software and research that creates all of these models, right? And so we see something that is by its very nature privatizing a huge amount of collective resources and very possibly selling that back to people, something that they should own, very possibly automating labor and making work more precarious with all of that data. And so there is a way in which we see a lot of disruptions. And I think it's quite clear that while AI does break many existing notions of property, this doesn't mean that it breaks power. It doesn't break state power because it can enable various forms of surveillance, as we discussed. It doesn't break corporate power. It's built on the kinds of material cloud monopolies that have underpinned technology at this point for decades. It doesn't break technocratic power. Very few people, vanishingly few people, get to decide the direction of this technology that is likely to affect all of us. And it doesn't break societal power or hierarchies. It has been seen to enforce systemic bias across the board, often deepen inequalities, and likely to do that more as it gets more entrenched into the labor ecosystem. And I think here is where we see that disrupting property doesn't necessarily mean disrupting power, and in fact, property relations end up recoalescing around where power is. And so we see all of these ways in which powerful actors are able to, sue AI companies and get rights for their images, but smaller artists are not. Like Getty Images has done this. We've seen big tech companies enclose huge amounts of data and open source software. We've seen, commons-based organizations like Wikipedia completely form the foundation of fact-checking and misinformation checking in the world without getting any remuneration for it. We've seen organizations like ICE in the US, where I'm from, which is a Homeland Security kind of anti-immigrant organization that privatizes public facial recognition data and sells it to tech companies like Palantir. We've seen data monopolies, and we don't end up getting often new data ownership structures, even though there is space for them. Instead, we see these kinds of entrenchments. And so while there are all of these ways that property relations get ruptured by this technology, what we are seeing by default is that power ends up recoalescing and taking on those ruptures in its own name. And I think a lot of what we work on at the Collective Intelligence Project is seeing how we can democratize artificial intelligence by using these ruptures in property to democratize power. And so that looks like a bunch of different kinds of work. There's work on data ownership and collective data ownership and having more agency over what it looks like for your own data, your own labor to go into these kinds of models. I know Holly and Matt will be speaking later, and they've done really fantastic work in this space. It looks like thinking about public infrastructure for all of the kinds of things that are currently privatized about this technology and mean that there's no public interest mandate for any of it. It looks like public cloud, public data stores, public options for AI. It looks like platform worker co-ops. We're seeing, an incredible wave of strikes, at least again in the US where I'm from. And some of these are touching on, Amazon workers and even Uber workers and people who can start coming together and fighting the ways that technology ends up individualizing and atomizing us into more collective structures. It looks like commons-based digital governance. It looks like digital dividends, right? Taking the profits that companies are making off of this privatized technology and saying, no, this is built on the commons. It should be returned to people. It looks like windfall taxes on AI companies. And so I think the point I'm making here is not that this is a set of answers to democratizing the future of technology, but rather that we do see every new wave of technology creating these ruptures in existing societal structures. However, those ruptures do not necessarily go in the direction of returning power to the people. And yet we can use those apertures to do so. And I think this is a time when that is still possible in the space of artificial intelligence. And the last thing I'll say is, I think at CIP, we very strongly believe that what we call artificial intelligence is truly collective intelligence. It's built on our collective knowledge, our collective wisdom, and it should be governed as such. And I think there are lots of specific concrete things we can do now, but we also need to think about what the future is that we want to look like and make sure that future is collectively owned. Thank you.